Tonight we've got a really interesting topic, 7 archaeological discoveries from the time of Hezekiah. We'll look at some amazing things, I think, and overall the objective of tonight is to banish this thought that the stories of the Bible, and particularly the stories about Hezekiah, are the stuff of myth and legend. It's not true. Hezekiah was a real man, he lived in Jerusalem, and he did a whole series of things just as described in the Bible. And we'll see tonight there's at least 7 good pieces of evidence that show us that this is a real man who did real things on the earth. So the Bible records the story of Hezekiah in 3 different places, in the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles and also in Isaiah as well. And it describes really the time when Hezekiah is king over Judah. Tonight we're not going to be looking at the story, we're looking at the archaeology. But it's worth just remembering for a moment what happened in the life of Hezekiah. So this man is a king of Judea in ancient Israel. He began his reign in about 715 BC, and he reigned for 29 years. And during that time, the story of the Bible describes some remarkable things that this man did. He was a reforming king. He completely transformed the religion in Jerusalem. He came to the throne, he opened the temple, he threw out the idols in Jerusalem, and he focused the attention of the people back on worshipping the God of the Bible. And he brought back the priests, and he changed the music. He did all of these things about worshipping God. And the Bible has a lot to say about those things. But he also did some other things. He did some things for the city of Jerusalem. When Hezekiah was king, the superpower was Assyria, and they lived in the west. The east. Their capital was Nineveh. And at about the time when Hezekiah was king, they were militantly going to the nations around them, particularly in the west where Judea was. And Hezekiah could see them coming, and he prepared the city of Jerusalem. He built the wall and strengthened it, and he secured inside the city of Jerusalem a water supply so that the city of Jerusalem could withstand a siege. Because if there was one thing that the Assyrians were really good at, and that was besieging cities and destroying them. So he set about preparing the city against the attack of Sennacherib. And of course, the Bible story tells us that Hezekiah is victorious. The Assyrians never took Jerusalem. They went back to Nineveh and they didn't come back again. So that's a very, very brief snapshot of what happened in the reign of Hezekiah. And I hope tonight we can see 7 good pieces of evidence that all of these things in the biblical story actually happened. They were real. Now, before we start looking at the 7 pieces of evidence, let's remember we're looking at archaeological discoveries. Archaeology is about the study of the past. And the further back in time we look, the more difficult it is to accurately find things that are archaeologically sound. Our memory fades over time. And I think we can do a very brief experiment to demonstrate that and convince us all. So here we are, 521 Goodwood Road. It's 6:15 on Sunday night. What was happening right here 1 week ago? Any ideas? Pottery. Excellent. And how do you know it, Andrew? You were here. We have an eyewitness of what happened. I wasn't here, but I saw the photos, so I'm convinced it happened as well. And that camera up the back there was filming. So if we wanted to find out what happened a week ago, we wind back the camera and we can see exactly what happened. So what have we got there? You've got a piece of the pottery. There we go. So we've got some pretty good evidence, don't we? So what about a year ago? What about the second Sunday in December last year? What was happening right here? Anyone know? There was a lecture. Very good. So no one remembers. But we could go back to the film, couldn't we? And we could see exactly who was speaking at this very place 12 months ago. But we can't just remember. We need to rely on records, don't we? So what about 10 years ago? What was happening here? I'm sure... That's right, you started at 7 o'clock. Very good answer. So at 7 o'clock, what was happening? Did we have the film 10 years ago? No, we didn't. So we can't go to that evidence. We had a tape recording, that's right. So we could go back to the tape recording and we could see who was speaking in this place. Or we could go back to other records. We could go to the syllabus, but our chairman will say the syllabus is a very vague guide as to what might happen on any Sunday. It's not actually a record, is it? It's a plan, and things change. So we need to go to records, not plans. So what about 50 years ago? What happened here at 7 o'clock? Was anyone here 50 years ago? There was another lecture. Some people were. But we'd have to go back to records, wouldn't we, to see what happened. Probably we would have a bit of trouble finding the syllabus. We might find in Uncle Jeff Berry's notes exactly who was speaking at what time and how long they went for and all the quotes they looked up. But we'd be very hard-pressed to find that record, wouldn't we? And that's 50 years ago. So what about 100 years ago? This hall wasn't here. Does anyone know what was here 100 years ago? A block of land. Good answer. Do we know more than that? There was a tram out the front. So what was happening on this block of land? No one really knows. So we could probably find out who owned the land. If we went back to the state records, we could maybe see what they used it for. But that's just 100 years. What about 200 years? What about 500 years? What about 2,700 years ago? That's when Hezekiah lived. It's a very long time ago, and we don't expect to find minute details about everything in Hezekiah's life. We just don't expect to find that. We're not going to see what he had for breakfast. We're not going to see what Isaiah was doing on a Tuesday morning. It's just not going to be there. We're going to find very specific pieces of evidence that have been carefully written down as a record, and perhaps very big things that have been built. So as we go through these 7 things, let's keep that in mind. It's a very long time ago. We don't expect to find everything, but when we do find a series of things, it gives us some very good evidence that something happened just as described in the Bible. So, let's come to our... actually, before we do that, does everyone have a handout? Hopefully you saw one when you came in the door. The handout is a really simple one. It's got 7 boxes on there for the 7 things we'll look at. And I think it's a good idea to perhaps write down the 7 discoveries that we'll talk about tonight, and perhaps write down when they were discovered, where they were discovered and where they are today, and also the key Bible passage that this discovery supports. So very simple, 7 different things. So let's talk about the first discovery. And here's a picture where this first discovery takes place. It's in about 1946, 1947, at this very place in Israel, down by the Red Sea, or the Dead Sea. And there's a young shepherd boy, his name is Muhammad, and he has a flock of goats that he's looking after. And some of them are lost in that valley there. It doesn't look very good, does it? There's not a lot of green grass. But it's a wonderful place if you're a goat, because goats can scramble up these rocks really, really quickly. Not so good if you're a shepherd boy and you've lost your goat here. It's really difficult to clamber up. And so Muhammad decides, I'm not going up every little valley here. I'm going to take a bunch of stones, and if I see a spot where I think the goat might be, I'm going to throw it up the hill. And if I hear something like that, there's a goat, and I'm going up to find it. So he's got his bucket of rocks, and he's throwing them up the hill, and that's what he hears. And he thinks, now that is not a goat. That is definitely not a goat. And this is the very spot where he threw the stone. And he goes up, and he looks in the cave, and he lowers himself in, and he discovers that what he's done is smash this little clay pot. And I think Matt's got a little chip from it, the very pot. And inside that pot, he finds a series of leather scrolls. And he sees another couple of clay jars in the cave, and he thinks, this is wonderful, maybe there's some treasure in the pots. And he starts opening them up, and to his dismay, there's no treasure at all. There's just a series of scrolls. And he thinks, what am I going to do? I'll take some of the best ones, and maybe I'll be able to sell them back in town. Here's one of the scrolls he found. And he takes that scroll, he takes it down to the cobbler who's interested in old things, and he sells it to him for $100, and he goes back home and he's happy. And the cobbler thinks, I reckon this is writing, maybe it's Coptic. Perhaps I'll go and talk to the local Coptic minister and see what he's got to say. And he has a look, and he says, that's not Coptic, that's Hebrew. And he takes the scroll and he goes on to a Hebrew expert. And the Hebrew expert starts reading this, and he realizes it's a text. It's a text from the Bible. And this is the scroll of Isaiah, discovered 1946 in Israel. You can see it today because Google has digitized all of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's a remarkable discovery. This scroll contains chapter 1 through to chapter 66 of Isaiah, the whole book, every part of it. And when the archaeologists had a look at this, they compared what they read with what we read tonight, Isaiah. We read from Isaiah. If you've got a King James version, it's in English, and it's a translation of a Hebrew text. Does anyone know when that text was written, the Hebrew text that the King James version is based on? Any ideas? No one. It's written in about 500 BC, not quite. It's written in about 950 AD. So 950 AD. But this scroll here was written in 150 BC, so 1,000 years earlier, this copy on the screen of Isaiah was written. And when they carefully compared each chapter and verse and letter, it is almost identical to the copies written 1,000 years later. Now that's important because the story of Hezekiah is written in the book of Isaiah. And the book of Isaiah, we have very good evidence to show us, has been accurately transmitted through time. Very, very accurately transmitted through time over 1,000 years. Let's come across to Isaiah chapter 1. Here's perhaps a key biblical verse that we can put next to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 1. The vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Isaiah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So this prophet lived when Hezekiah lived. He wrote down these prophecies, and we have a very accurate record of what this man wrote. Now, back in the Dead Sea Scrolls, over the next 10 years, 12 different caves were discovered. Every book of the Old Testament except for Esther. 15,000 manuscript fragments. There's an enormous body of evidence that supports the accuracy of our Old Testaments that we have in front of us. The very manuscripts that describe to us the story of Hezekiah. So, let's come to box number 2, the second discovery from the time of Hezekiah. This one's a much smaller thing, and it was discovered in 2009, very recently, just 10 years ago, in Jerusalem. It's a seal made out of clay. It's only about 2 or 3 centimetres wide and a couple of mils thick. And it was discovered 2009 in Jerusalem in an archaeological dig. People were working through an ancient rubbish tip, and they found this seal, and they take it back to their lab, and in 2015 they translated what is on the seal. And this is what it says: belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. Now, let's come across to 2 Chronicles 28. 2 Chronicles 28. 2 Chronicles 28, verse 27. And Ahaz slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city, even in Jerusalem. But they brought him not into the sepulchres of the kings of Israel. And Hezekiah his son reigned in his stead. Chapter 29, verse 1. Hezekiah began to reign when he was 25 years old. He reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abijah, the daughter of Zechariah. So this seal is effectively the signature of Hezekiah. This is what he stamped into clay when he owned something or when he sent something. Chapter 28 of 2 Chronicles, verse 27, precisely corroborates what this seal says. Hezekiah is king of Judah, and Ahaz is his father. This discovery confirms exactly what we read here in Chronicles. Let's come across to another discovery, the third one for tonight. And I think it's one that many of us have heard about. This is, of course, the Hezekiah Tunnel. It's a tunnel in Jerusalem. It's been discovered multiple times in modern history. The latest discovery was in the sort of 1860s. And it's this great big tunnel that goes through the rock underneath Jerusalem. And I know a number of people here have walked through the tunnel in the last year or so. So here's a map of what the tunnel's like. Here's the ancient city of Jerusalem. Here's the Gihon Spring towards the north. And this blue line is where the tunnel goes. It's 530 metres long. It's not just a trivial ditch underneath this hall. It's 0.5 kilometre in length through solid limestone. It's a phenomenal thing to discover. And at about this point here, in 1884, there was something discovered inside the tunnel, and this is what it was. It was an inscription found in the wall, and that inscription today is in the museum in Istanbul. You can go and see it. And this is what it has to say. It really tells us the story about the tunnel that Hezekiah dug. The tunnel, and this is the story of the tunnel, while the axes were against each other, and while 3 cubits were left to cut, the voice of a man called to his counterpart, for there was a zada, a crack or a fissure in the rock on the right, and on the day of the tunnel being finished, the stonecutters struck each man towards his counterpart, axe against axe, and flowed water from the source to the pool for 1,200 cubits. And 100 cubits was the height over the head of the stonecutters. So we have a description written at the time the tunnel was dug, describing the events that took place. So if we come back to the map, the inscription tells us the diggers started at each end of the tunnel. So one group here and one group down here, and they worked towards each other. And when they were about 3 cubits apart, so about this far, they could start to hear each other's voices, and they dig towards each other, and then finally they break through the tunnel, and the water starts to flow through. So it's a remarkable thing to be doing 2,700 years ago. And there's a whole series of biblical passages which completely confirm that this was the tunnel of Hezekiah's time. Let's come to 2 Kings 20. 2 Kings 20, verse 20. And the rest of the acts of Hezekiah, and all his might, and how he made a pool and a conduit and brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So here's a one-verse summary of the life of Hezekiah. He did some amazing things. One of the things he did was bring a water supply into the city so they could withstand a siege. He takes water from the pool, he digs a conduit and makes another pool inside the city. Exactly what Hezekiah's tunnel does today. Let's come to 2 Chronicles chapter 32. We have another description of what Hezekiah has done. 2 Chronicles 32, verse 30. This same Hezekiah also stopped the upper watercourse of Gihon and brought it straight down to the west side of the city of David. And Hezekiah prospered in all his work. So we've got a very similar description of what he did, but this time there's a couple of landmarks there. The tunnel starts in Gihon, he blocks up this area, and he brings the water down to the west of the city of King David. And that's just what we see in this tunnel. In fact, there is some evidence that this area was blocked with rubble at around the time Hezekiah was king. So that corroborates what we read in Chronicles as well. And one last passage, let's come to Isaiah 22 that we read tonight. This passage also speaks about the tunnel of Hezekiah. Isaiah 22, verse 9. Isaiah 22, verse 9. Ye have seen also the breaches of the city of David, that they are many, and they gathered together the waters of the lower pool. Verse 11, ye made also a ditch between the two walls for the water of the old pool. So it describes two pools. There's an old one, and then a ditch down to the new one, the lower pool. Exactly the tunnel of Hezekiah, bringing the water inside the city. So 3 biblical passages, all corroborated by archaeological evidence we can see today, either in Jerusalem or in a museum in Istanbul. So let's come to number 4, the fourth piece of evidence. This one was discovered in the 1970s. It's in Jerusalem, and it's called the Broad Wall. And it's this ancient piece of wall here. You can see it's particularly wide. You can see the stone is fairly smooth on the outside, but it's a complete mess in the middle. You can see it's in a public space. You can go there, you can see it. There's plaques on the wall. You can walk down the steps. You can see the Broad Wall. And to give us some context, here's a map of ancient Jerusalem. Here's the tunnel of Hezekiah that we just saw. And this orange part is the wall that Hezekiah contributed to. And particularly here, in the northwest corner, the Broad Wall. A piece of archaeological evidence supporting the work of Hezekiah. Now let's have a look at a couple of passages. One of them's here in Isaiah 22, and have a look at how it describes the work of Hezekiah when he's building the wall. Let's go back to verse 9. Ye have seen also the breaches of the city of David. There's holes in the wall, that they are many. Ye gathered together the waters of the lower pool. Ye have numbered the houses of Jerusalem, and the houses have ye broken it down to fortify the wall. So it's not an ordinary wall. In Hezekiah's day, we had the inner wall for the city. There were houses out here. Hezekiah sees that he needs additional defense. He pulls down the houses, and he uses the rubble to build this wall. And that's why here we can see that the internals of this wall are built with rubble. It's not built like the other parts of the wall of the city. Now let's come to 2 Chronicles 32. We have another description of the building projects of Hezekiah. 2 Chronicles 32. Let's remember, here's Hezekiah. It's 701 BC. The mighty Assyrian Empire is coming. He's got to do something to help defend his city. And building the wall is a key part of that. 2 Chronicles 32, verse 5. Also, Hezekiah strengthened himself and built up all of the wall that was broken and raised it up to the towers and another wall without, and repaired Millo in the city of David and made darts and shields in abundance. He fortifies the city very carefully in response to the pending invasion from Sennacherib. Now, let's move on to the next discovery. We've looked at 4 so far. Now we're coming to number 5. This one was discovered in 1870, just outside Jerusalem. There was a French archaeologist. He's digging just outside the walls in an area where there's lots of ancient tombs. And he finds this rock, and you can see there's some engraving on there. And you can see also that there's a hole right in the middle of the writing, which is very unfortunate. And like so many of these things, he carves it out and he sends it back to Britain. He sends it back to the British Museum, and it sits there until 1952, a long time afterwards, when somebody cracks the code. Somebody works out what the writing actually says. They decipher the engraving on this rock, and this is what it has to say. This is the grave of Shebaniah, who is over the house. There is no silver or gold here, only his bones, and the bones of his maidservant with him. Cursed be the man who opens this. So it seems to be the tombstone, the headpiece of stone above the grave of a man called Shebaniah. And the archaeologist who first deciphered this code tells us that this part of the name at the end, Yahu, is a sort of derivation of the name of God, Yahweh. And it was put on the end of many different names in ancient Israel. And this man, most likely, was the Shebna of Isaiah 22. Let's come back there to Isaiah 22. We read this chapter tonight, and it didn't mention Hezekiah once. But it mentioned the wall, as we've seen. It mentioned the watercourse that he dug, and it mentions his companions as well. Let's have a look in verse 15. Thus saith the Lord God of hosts, Go, get thee unto this treasurer, even unto Shebna, which is over the house. The very person whose name is carved in this piece of stone, the man who is over the house. We might have Timothy and Tim, it's the same person, Shebna, Shebaniah, which is over the house, and say, What hast thou here? Whom hast thou here, that thou hast hewed thee out a sepulchre here? As he hath hewed thee out a sepulchre on high, and hath graven an habitation for himself in a rock. And Isaiah goes on to rebuke this man for carefully feathering his nest and taking advantage of the people in Jerusalem when he should have been, with Hezekiah, protecting them from the Assyrians. And one of the things he's done in verse 16 is make this wonderful tomb just outside the walls of Jerusalem. So this archaeological discovery is really remarkable, because in verse 15 we have the exact person with the same title, and in verse 16 we have the very rock discovered that Isaiah condemns him for carving in verse 16. And we can go to the British Museum, it's on display, we can see the very rock that Isaiah was talking about, and the very man, Shebna, carved this, who was the second in command to Hezekiah when he was king. Now, there's more discoveries, of course. The Shebna tombstone, 1870, deciphered in 1952, corroborates Isaiah 22, verse 15 to 16. You can see the rock today. The next one, I think, is almost as remarkable, perhaps even more so. And this is a whole series of carvings in stone. It's the Lachish relief. And these were discovered in Iraq, in Nineveh. And like so many things that were discovered in the 1800s, it was plundered from Iraq and sent back to Britain. And again, it's in the British Museum. And there's 12 metres of this carving that's all around the museum. And you can go there and you can see it. And one of the things you'll see in the carving is this picture here. It's a picture of Sennacherib, the king of the Assyrians. And up here is an inscription describing what all of the relief is about. And the relief is a really remarkable thing. If we can perhaps turn down the lights, if that's possible. I've got a short video. Thankfully, I didn't make this one like last time. It's much more professional, but it has a wonderful story about the relief. So hopefully this is something you can hear.
In the year 701 BCE, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, led a vast army against the kingdom of Judea. King Hezekiah, who had rebelled against the Assyrian Empire, now confronted the world's greatest war machine. The Assyrian army was powerful and extremely well organized. It was composed of a hierarchy of officers, professional soldiers, and specialized forces, cavalry, archers, infantry, and engineering corps. Upon its arrival, 46 fortified cities fell one after the other. The revolt's suppression reached its climax with the conquest of Lachish, the second most important city in the Judean kingdom. In his prophecies, the prophet Isaiah warns, "Now therefore behold, the Lord brings upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, the king of Assyria in all his glory, and it will rise over all its channels and go over all its banks. And it shall pass through Judah, it shall overflow and go over, it shall reach even to the neck." Sennacherib boasts of his successes in war, and especially of the conquest of Lachish. He orders the carving of a 12-meter-long relief depicting the city's conquest. The relief panels were displayed in Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh and were only uncovered 2,700 years later. They are currently exhibited at the British Museum in London. The relief accurately portrays the operation of the Assyrian war machine, from the Battle of Lachish to the parade of war captives in front of Sennacherib's throne. Depicted in the panels are huge siege machines that enable the army to break into the besieged city, as well as sophisticated battering rams, deadly stone slings, skilled archers, and more. They also depict psychological war tactics employed by the Assyrians to dishearten the Jewish warriors, such as displaying captives impaled on wooden spikes, skinning of live prisoners, and other horrific forms of torture. Despite all of these, the residents of Lachish fight valiantly. They are shown throwing flaming torches, chariot wheels, and anything they could lay their hands on at the heads of the Assyrian soldiers. Their efforts are to no avail, and the residents of Lachish that survived, mainly women and children, and all the spoils of war that were plundered, were exiled and forced to march humiliated before King Sennacherib as he sat reviewing them on his throne. In the relief above Sennacherib's head, there is an Akkadian inscription explicitly referring to the conquered city of Lachish. Sennacherib, king of the universe, king of Assyria, sits on a throne, and the spoils of Lachish are paraded before him. Now that Lachish has fallen, the Assyrian army marches onward to Hezekiah's city, Jerusalem, capital of Judea.
So I think it's fair to say that is pretty remarkable evidence, isn't it? That's a very detailed record of what was going on in Lachish, as the narrator pronounces it. Here's another section for the panel. I love this one. We've got the wonderful ramp going up to the wall. We've got the archers that we saw in the video, and we've got this battering ram, and they're smacking against the wall, and the Israelis are throwing down these firebrands on top of them. And it describes here and shows perhaps the very first recorded fire extinguisher. You can see this brave Assyrian with a stick and a bucket on the end full of water. He's sort of reaching over backwards, tipping it onto the fire that's being thrown down on top of him. These are incredibly detailed pictures of what happened in ancient Israel. Incredibly detailed descriptions. Let's come to Isaiah 36. Isaiah 36. Now, it came to pass, thank you. in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the defenced cities of Judah and took them. We know that that's true. We've seen a picture of the very king Sennacherib in verse 1. Verse 2. And the king of Assyria sent Rabshakeh from Lachish to Jerusalem unto King Hezekiah with a great army. We saw in that video footage the tell of Lachish. We saw the complete battle description, and we saw that great army that's described in verse 2. We come across to chapter 37, verse 8. Rabshakeh returned and found the king of Assyria warring against Libnah, for he had heard that he was departed from Lachish. The Assyrians come to Lachish, they destroy the city. We saw all the detail about that destruction, and then they move on to the next place. That is remarkably strong archaeological evidence that corroborates entirely Isaiah 36, verse 1 and 2, and Isaiah 37, verse 8 as well. Now, let's move on to the next discovery. And this one relates very closely to what we've just seen. It's the Taylor Prism, again discovered in Nineveh, plundered from Iraq, taken back to Britain, and displayed in the British Museum. It's a cylinder of clay, and it's got text all over it. And just like we've seen the pictures of the battles, now we've got the words, we've got the writing, we've got the Assyrian description of exactly what they did in war. Here's a deciphering of one of the pieces from this cylinder. As for the king of Judah, Hezekiah, he's a real man, he's described in the record, who had not submitted to my authority, just as we see in the biblical record. I besieged and captured 46 of his fortified cities, just as we saw in Isaiah 36, verse 1, along with many smaller towns taken in battle with my battering rams, just like we saw in the picture. I took as plunder 200,150 people, both small and great, male and female, along with a great number of animals, including horses, mules, donkeys, camels, oxen, and sheep, just like we saw paraded before him in the Lachish relief. As for Hezekiah, I shut him up like a caged bird in his royal city of Jerusalem. That's where Hezekiah was king. I then constructed a series of fortresses around him. I did not allow anyone to come out of the city gates. His towns which I captured, I gave to the kings of Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza. So he describes Hezekiah as a very real man in Jerusalem. He describes a blockade against Jerusalem. But if we have a look very carefully, he does not describe the destruction of Jerusalem. And that corroborates what we know from the biblical record, doesn't it? He comes to Judea, but he doesn't take Jerusalem. That's the story of Hezekiah. Have a look up here. It talks about besieging and capturing and taking in battle with battering rams all of these other cities. But down the bottom, he does not use that language to describe Jerusalem. He says there's a blockade, but he doesn't describe the battering ram. He doesn't describe taking the city. Now let's come across to Isaiah 37, because this is where the biblical the story speaks about that. Isaiah 37, verse 33. Therefore, thus saith the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, Jerusalem, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shields, nor cast a bank against it. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return, and shall not come into this city, saith the Lord. He's not going to destroy Jerusalem. And there in verse 33 is a remarkably accurate description of Assyrian warfare. Think about the Lachish relief and verse 33. The arrows that they shot, the shields that they used, the bank that they built. It's all described in verse 33, but that won't happen to Jerusalem. And the war records of Assyria never used the language of battering rams and shields and embankments against Jerusalem, because it never happened. Let's think about Sennacherib going back to his palace, going back to Nineveh, and carving on his walls for 12 meters the jewel in the crown of his campaign. If he had taken Jerusalem, what would be on the wall? It would most definitely be the capital, wouldn't it? But it's not. It's not there. It's Lachish. He won the semi-final and he takes that trophy home, but he does not have the grand final trophy on his wall. He didn't win. He missed out. He shows the best he has done, but he didn't win the grand final. Now that cylinder, I think, is a remarkable discovery, isn't it? It corroborates so many biblical things. And to find this record in the rubble of a site is a truly amazing thing, a battle that was 2,700 years ago. But there's something even more amazing. There's another one. There's another record of the same thing on another cylinder in a museum in Chicago. And it corroborates entirely the message on the Taylor Prism. And guess what? There's another one. And this one's also been discovered, and that's in a museum in Jerusalem. And guess what? There's another one. And this one's in the British Museum. And this one, we're told, is written by the Assyrians within a few months of getting home to Nineveh. This is the most contemporary record we could imagine. There's 11 independent records by the Assyrians of what happened. And we can go and we can see these things. They're real. The records are real from 2,700 years ago. That is remarkably strong archaeological evidence supporting the biblical record. So perhaps tonight, to sum up, I think there's a lot we can learn from archaeology that corroborates the story of Hezekiah in the Bible. We've seen 7 different things. The story in the Bible has been accurately transmitted to us. The man Hezekiah was real. He is not a myth. We've got his signature. You can go and see it. He's a real man. The things he did in the Bible record are all real. We can see the tunnel that he dug. We can go and see the wall that he built. His companions were real. Isaiah was a real man. Shebna, his second in command, was a real person. We can see his tombstone. In fact, there's the seal of Shebna as well. We can see his signature. His enemies were real as well. The Assyrians, Sennacherib, the conquest of Judea, the fact they didn't take Jerusalem. All of these things are very strongly supported by archaeological evidence. And I think it's fair to say Hezekiah is not a man of myth. It's real. It is a true story.